There's this idea that food is something that we can all universally relate to on some level. Not everybody has access to the same foods. So I want to be clear about that. But, as human beings, food is something that we have to eat to survive. And so at a basic level, we all understand that. And we can all relate to food in that way. And so I think that it's really important that if there is this one universal thing that we can all relate to, then there is this one universal thing that we can use to talk about the human experience and to talk about living, and coexisting, right, and all of those things. And I am of the personal opinion that one can't exist freely until everyone exists freely. And I think food is a really good way of getting people to think about that, because it is something that's like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way before.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to another edition of the podcast. If you're new here, it's so great to have you along, and just to let you know what you're getting yourself into, my name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, curator, producer, etc. But mostly, I would simply say that I am a maker. I just really love to make things, whether it's music or I even built a deck once, whatever it may be. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creative people to discuss their journey, process, philosophies, basically whatever it is that makes them who they are and inspires them to, in turn, be makers themselves. And if you've been listening for a bit, I really appreciate it. It's good to have you here again. On today's episode of Music Maker, I'm quite excited to shake things up a little bit with my guest, Carlynn Crosby. Carlynn Crosby is a writer and editor based in Gainesville, Florida, where her interests range from archival research on Florida food and culture to experimental forms of fiction and memoir. She currently works in book publishing and is pursuing a PhD in literature. She has been described as, I quote, decent. Carlynn and I first met about a decade ago when I was living in Tampa, and I've really appreciated the work that she's done as a writer, just kind of being a distant observer. And the major focus of her work is all things Florida, and especially like being a champion for her home state despite its flaws, just uncovering really cool stories. And Carlynn is a storyteller. She tells stories about Florida, places, and people, and we dig deeply into what that means for her. And we also talk quite a bit about food in this conversation, but again, it's not like, what's your favorite food? What do you like to cook? Rather, it's how writing about food can be something like a catalyst to springboard into other kinds of cultural and societal topics. This conversation was so much fun, and it was also so enlightening, and I just can't wait for you to hear it. As always, a little bit of business to take care of right before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast is by listening. You can listen to this episode, of course, but listen to earlier episodes if this is your first one or if you're new here. Tell your friends to listen if you think they might like it, and then give us a follow on your favorite podcast platform, and that will ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released and pushed straight to your device. Also, an equally impactful way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and a review if you're able to and if you feel inclined. We have gotten a couple of those so far, and it's been so great to read your thoughts, and I'd love to share more of them here on the podcast. So if you feel strongly about the show, if you find value in these conversations, please do be in touch. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or now on Spotify, you can leave comments on each individual episode, and I suppose you can get some conversation going there. So ratings, reviews, comments, the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we are able to grow. Now, on to my conversation with Carlynn Crosby. Well, Carlynn, it's so great to sit down with you today, and we were just talking before that we met around 10 years ago, and I think that might have been the only time that we've really sat down and talked with one another, and so it's been quite some time, I think, since we've really spoken like this, but I'm excited to catch up with you, get to know everything that you've got going on. And you're the second writer that I've spoken to as well. So I'm sure we'll get into some different kinds of weeds that I normally don't get into with musicians. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, yeah, of course. I was just thinking about this earlier. We met because I was writing for the Tampa Bay Times, and you and your partner were doing, I think it was like a beer and wine pairing concert series.
Yeah, terroir. Yeah.
Yes. And I remember thinking that was so cool. I was so excited to go and see what y'all were doing. And you just always have really great ideas. So I was really glad when you reached out to me.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited. So, where we like to begin here on Music Maker is as far back as you remember or that you're willing to share. And as a writer, I'm sure this is like you could kind of answer this in different ways because, in a sense, we all have to be writers, like going through school and stuff. So, I guess we'll kind of frame it more like writing in, I guess, the artistic sense, that the kind of writing that you do today. So, what would you say is your earliest artistic memory as a writer?
It actually takes place in school, but I was in second grade and we had a substitute teacher for the day. And our regular teacher had left us some sort of like a free writing prompt or something like that. And I don't even remember what the prompt was, probably because I didn't care what the prompt was. I was just going to write what I wanted to write.
Yeah.
And so there was a train in a park outside of my grandfather's house, like a full size train that we used to climb on as little kids. And this prompt was read aloud for, writing time or whatever. And I wrote a short story trying to imagine how that train had gotten there, who had been on the train, because in second grade I think I was probably like 6 or 7. I couldn't really wrap my mind around like how a full-size train was in a park and not like on train tracks.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. That's fair.
I was I was trying to like imagine like where this train had come from and all of these things. And I remember turning it in later, and the substitute she was like, this isn't really the prompt. And I'm sure I kind of argued with her about like why my story was better and why I wanted to write what I wanted to write. And it's pretty emblematic, I think, of how I write today. I mean, I write about what I want to write about, and even if there's a prompt or there's some sort of question, I find myself still trying to figure out how to work in like what I actually want to talk about.
Yeah.
So it, that was probably the earliest time I ever remember really doing something like that. But yeah, it definitely set the tone, I think, for for my future as a writer.
So you grew up in Florida, which is something we're going to talk about quite a bit soon. But
Yes.
I know, like when I was growing up in Kentucky, through I think it started in late elementary school, in the middle school, high school, like we had to write like a writing portfolio. Like we had to write a short story. We had to write like an essay that was like well researched and that kind of stuff. It's very much like standardized testing kind of checkbox. All the students have to do this, and I won't get into my opinions about that, but I remember really enjoying that personally and just kind of like being able to flex my creative muscles through those exercises throughout school when a lot of my peers were like, they saw it as a chore, much like it probably is something like that. So, I mean, was that you? I mean, did you embrace those kinds of assignments when you were in school growing up? I mean, what was that like for you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I definitely did. And some of those memories I have associated with that are pretty mortifying. Like I remember in middle school we were in like our social studies class or something, and we were introducing ourselves to each other. And everybody kind of made these like small little picture boards, with like, these are my parents and these are my siblings and this is my dog and this is my iguana, whatever. And I wrote a poem. I read it out loud to the class, and it was like, looking back on it, it was so like the two roads diverged in a wood, like that kind of weirdness.
Yeah.
And my mom actually kept it, and I remember finding it in the garage and just being like re-humiliated all over again. But yeah, I mean, I always gravitated towards the more creative side of projects. I really enjoyed getting to write. I always wrote way more than I needed to, especially like when you're in grade school, there's usually like a word count, to get students to write enough.
Right.
And I
Sure.
was the one who was always writing way more than that. If I had writing assignments, I was doing them that day when I got home from school. I wasn't waiting till the last minute. I was really eager and really excited to do that stuff. So I would definitely say I embraced that probably a lot more than some of my peers did, but I definitely didn't embrace it as much as some of my peers did. Well, I don't know, actually. I haven't really talked to anybody from that period of my life, to really ask them, like, did you think of me as a writer back then? But I definitely, had in my mind some of my peers that I was like, oh, this person's like a lit geek, like this person's going to be a writer, or this, and I never really thought about myself that way. But now that we're talking about it, I guess I might have been qualified as one of those people too.
That's why I like to start this conversation with those types of questions, is because when I think about my own trajectory, there's always like a thread, right? There's like, oh, even as far back as like you wouldn't think there would be a thread, but there is. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know like if I ever could have imagined doing stuff like this at that age too. But here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Here we are.
So as you were kind of getting into later in high school, like I'm sure your voice as a writer was maturing, what kinds of stuff I mean, besides maybe the prompts that you were given to write about as assignments, and maybe this goes back to your other point of like you tried to work in things when you weren't supposed to or whatever. I mean, what kinds of topics did you want to write about at that age, like as you were kind of approaching college?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I was really thinking about it very much in high school. I did get some experience with kind of like a student newspaper, and I really didn't like it because it felt very prompt oriented, like we had some, advice from an advisor who was like, you may want to consider writing about this, or you may want to consider writing about that. And we had student editors who were assigning topics to people. And so I got assigned a topic that I really didn't want to write very much about. And so I wasn't interested in it. My
Mm.
interviews were horrible. This is totally bad journalistic practice. I know this now, but I fudged some quotes for my high school newspaper uh, because I was so bored with the assignment and bored with journalistic writing, which is so funny because when you and I met, I was writing for a newspaper. I did not fudge quotes by that point. I learned that that's not something you do. But I didn't really start thinking about writing honestly until college. Like I had some experience doing some copy editing, and I wrote for a collegiate level food publication. I was really more interested in editing books, which I'm very fortunate to be doing now as a career, but I wanted to get some editing experience, and there was this food publication that was looking for editors, and so I decided, that I'd give it a shot, and I really enjoyed it. I got to write I think one of my pieces then was about I cooked only Ina Garten recipes for a week.
I love that.
It was kind of like a Julie and Julia thing, not as intense because I was balling on a budget, but I wrote a little bit about what I learned, which this is really going back into the recesses of my memory, but I think I wrote about paying attention at the grocery store to what I was buying because one of Ina Garten's big things is good vanilla, good olive oil. And I was like, what the F does that mean? And so I was trying to figure it out. Like I was at the grocery store and I was like looking at stuff. I remember I was doing, price comparisons, and I was looking at the ingredients and where things were grown. And so it was actually like a really interesting learning experience. And I got to write about recipes and restaurants that were opening in Gainesville. And I remember having so much fun with that when it came time to trying to figure out the job market, I was like, well, I like this is fun, let's see if we can do something with that.
When would you say your first encounter with a writer as like a career writer was in your life?
Yeah. Gosh, I think this is going to take us probably back to middle school. When I was in 7th grade, I had a teacher who was a book reviewer for the Tampa Bay Times. So, I would be in her class, checking books out of her personal library to read and tearing through them. I was a voracious reader. And she approached me and said, I write book reviews for the newspaper. And I remember that was kind of the first time that I really encountered somebody who was writing professionally, aside from, what I was reading. I always read books and I had this kind of idea of what novelists and authors were like, but, I'd never met a poet in real life. I'd never met, anybody like that until her name was Miss Atkins, and she was a book reviewer for the newspaper. And she introduced me to this thing that HarperCollins was doing, where I guess it was market research or something. And they would send out advanced review copies of books to teenagers if they could write, a little blurb about why they were interested and why they'd be a good reviewer. And so I got to practice writing book reviews because I would read these books and then I would submit a little report to HarperCollins. And I think that whole experience for me kind of really shaped my perception, I guess, of the relationship between reading and writing. To be a writer, you have to read. And I think to some extent, readers should write a little bit too. And I'm sure most people probably do. They just don't realize it. We all have to write these days, whether we're texting or emailing or doing the crossword puzzle. We all are writers, I think, in some fashion. And so that experience with her, I think, really crystallized that for me.
Yeah, I love that. So we're kind of jumping around, which is totally great. But just to kind of connect the dots here a little bit. So
keep me on track. Keep me on track.
I'll do my best. So you wrote about this short story about a train, unprompted, kind of, or against the prompt, whatever. That was elementary school. Middle school, you were writing book reviews for HarperCollins, which is awesome, or something of that sort, right? And then kind of working in like newspaper sort of stuff through high school. You go to college, you work for a college level food publication. Can you kind of, I guess from there, kind of share a bit of an overview of what your creative journey was like as a writer? I mean, do you feel like you followed a more conventional path? And I don't even know what that would be because I don't do writing, or were there like unexpected twists by what you would say?
I think my path was probably conventional in the sense that it was very hard for me to get a job. It felt unconventional for me because I always expected, I was going to graduate college, I was going to get a job, I was going to get married, I was going to own a house and have kids and do all of this stuff all by the time I was 30. And here I am, I just celebrated my 31st birthday and I haven't really done any of those things. But I think that's actually probably more conventional to not get a job right away and to have to bounce around and try a bunch of different things, which is exactly what I did. I graduated college and all of my friends were getting jobs. I had a couple of friends who got jobs at publications and newspapers and things. And some people got jobs at PR agencies and some people got jobs at, publishers, and I wasn't getting anything. So I was like, well, I like this food writing thing. I'm going to try and see what I can figure out there. And so I got an unpaid internship at a local magazine in the Tampa Bay area. And I did that for a couple of months and really enjoyed it. But then the internship was coming to a close and I was like, well, I'm back to square one. I still don't have a job. And so then I reached out to the food editor at the Tampa Bay Times and was like, do you guys have any positions open? Are you looking for, any reporters, anything like that? And I took a gig with them as a freelance correspondent, which felt like something, but in reality, it was a freelance gig. It wasn't full time. There was no salary. There were no benefits. It was very, very strictly freelance part time. And so, I was bartending and waiting tables trying to make this writing thing work.
Right.
Couldn't make it work. went to grad school, did some freelance writing while I was in grad school. Pandemic hit, kept doing freelance writing while I was trying to, figure out my next steps and figure out what I was going to do. And I honestly truly believe, based on writers that I have talked to and friends of mine, that is the more common trajectory for a lot of people who want to write. It's very hard to make a living doing writing and writing alone. I mean, unless you are one of the fortunate people to get, a salaried position at a major publication. But even then, I mean, those folks are having a really hard time because the media landscape is changing so much and those jobs are changing so much, and the job security is just not there anymore. I mean, thinking about Florida publications in general, we constantly are hearing about rounds of layoffs and those sorts of things. So I said, keep me on track. And I feel like I've gotten pretty far away from your original question, but that's kind of connecting the dots, I guess, in that writing for me has always been something that I have been passionate about. And it's always been something that I have wanted to do, but it's always had to be something that I've done on the side because it's not secure enough, at least for me. If anybody has figured out a way to write as a freelancer and that pays all of their bills, they're welcome to get in touch with me. I would love to know their strategies for that.
Well, it's really interesting to me because I think what you're describing is exactly what it's like to be a writer of music, right? Because, most people I know, I have so many friends with doctorates because that's what you do. Like if you want to be a professional musician now and have a secure, stable job, you go the academic path. And I think a lot of composers would say, that's what allows me to keep writing and like make a living and that kind of stuff. But it's still, I know composers in academic positions who, they still talk about it like, yeah, I write when I can. It's like
Mm-hmm.
because it's very demanding, or they kind of cram everything into the summer. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know. I think it's probably just the capitalist hellscape we live in, but that's just me.
Yeah, we can definitely go on a tear about that for a
Yeah.
while.
Well, before we do that, let me ask you this, and then we'll kind of start getting more into the work you do today and kind of your philosophies and process. So, with what you just said in mind, that writing is your passion, but it has to be secondary by nature in a lot of ways. That being said, when did you know that you wanted to pursue this craft as a career, or chase after it as a career?
Mm. I don't know that I ever really knew it, and I still don't know if I know. I remember the first time somebody identified me as a writer, and I was like, "Are you talking to me?" Me? And this happened too when someone called me a journalist. I was like, "Me?" And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it comes from a place of humility. I don't know if it comes from a place of insecurity. But I guess what I keep coming back to is it's the only identity for me that I feel like it works, like it's accurate. Like I don't know if I could really call myself anything else. And so I think, the first step for me was and still is kind of settling into that, calling myself a writer, calling myself a creative, calling myself, by that name. I sometimes wonder if that is why I don't put more emphasis on my writing. I've gone through periods. It's definitely always been something that's been, I'm going to do it when I can. If I see a call for pitches, or if I see, a really a prompt. It's so funny. We started this conversation with like, I hate prompts. And now, I'm all of my freelance writing is pretty much based on like, send me your pitches. But, it's been hard for me, I think, to really identify some of those things. We had just talked about, capitalist hellscape, and my life is so consumed, I think, with work. You know what I mean? It turns into, trying to fit the writing in when I can, when the writing is something that I really enjoy. And I think a part of me is kind of resistant to the idea of turning it into a full-blown career because I want to preserve the part of writing that I really love. You know what I mean? And some of that is that it's flexible, that I can write when I want to, and I can, I'm not on a deadline with most of my projects. I mean,
Yeah.
when it comes to freelancing and you pitch things, you have deadlines and you have to, abide by those things, and that's fine. But you can pick and choose when you want to take projects and when you don't want to take projects. So from that regard, I'm very fortunate that I have a stable income somewhere else, and that enables me to kind of engage in writing at a time and place and pace that feels comfortable for me. So in some ways, I don't want it to be a career because I want to be able to preserve that part of the creative process that I really like, and the part of it that feels, I guess, more organic and less driven by, oh, I need to get this in soon because I need this money to pay my electric bill. But then there are other times, where it's like, well, this is one of the things that I really enjoy. And if I'm spending so much of my time working and so much of my time sleeping, and the only time I have left in the day is a handful of hours, wouldn't it be nice to spend all of my time doing something that I really enjoy? So I'm constantly vacillating between those two things, I think.
Well, I mean, I think what you're talking about, it resonates with me so much because you're describing my life to a T.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying about identity and preserving, like there is something liberating about being able to just do the projects you want to do without having to worry about like paying rent or eat, like buying food, for example, like like living, making a living, like being able to live off of that income. There's something very liberating about that, and I've been able to write some of my best music because it's like I don't have to worry about finishing this and rushing through it to get the fee, and I can like take as much time as I want and it's going to be great. But then you're right, I work a lot, and a lot of times the thing that gets like kind of put on the back burner the most is composing, and that's like a huge bummer. And so I'm constantly trying to like find the sweet spot, right? And like,
Yeah.
and I think what you said about identity, like, right, being a writer is like feels like the most appropriate label for your identity. I was talking with someone about that once because that's how I've always felt as a composer. Like I do all kinds of things, I wear all kinds of hats, but being a composer is who I am. It's like my identity. And this person told me like I understand that, but it's okay to like acknowledge your hats that you wear. You can be all of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That is true. That is true. And I think so many people wear so many hats now. It's not just necessarily related to work. You can be a mom, you can be a spouse, you can be you can be a writer, you can be an editor, you can be a cook, you can be I mean, there's so many different things that we all embody all the time. So it really doesn't need to be distilled down to one thing. I definitely agree with that, and that it's important that we hold space, I think, for all of the different hats that we wear, because that's kind of an inescapable reality of the world that we live in now. Like, if I think it's impossible in this day and age to really just be one thing. Constantly are having to adapt and be flexible and take one hat off and put a different one on.
Exactly. So, a lot of your work right now is so centered on Florida, and so I think most of for those listening, you're welcome or I apologize, but most of this is going to be about Florida now. so, that's where we met. I lived in Tampa for 6 years, and we were talking before this about like when I go back to Tampa and like how things have changed and how like my feelings about that, and we can certainly talk about that. But I kind of want to build up into your thoughts about the current state of things by asking you about what Florida means to you, because you speak so poetically about Florida on your website and you talk about how Florida has been your family's home for generations. Can you talk a bit about what growing up in Florida was like, how that kind of set the stage for your creative life and just what it means to you?
So I went to the same high school as my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother in St. Pete. And this is something that I think a lot of people talk about, where especially people that are moving to the States, how rare it is to meet somebody who has family that goes back a couple of generations. And I don't think it's actually that rare. I just don't think those folks are the ones whose stories get told or get amplified. You know, Florida for me is home, and I grew up in St. Pete and I wanted to leave it. And, for a long time, I thought I was going to go into publishing in New York and I was never going to return to Florida. And I think, this is pretty common for anybody who grew up in one place and is getting ready to leave. I could come up with a laundry list of things that I didn't like about Florida. It's flat. I didn't like the people I went to school with. I didn't feel like I had any friends. I wanted to see something different. It was boring. There was nothing to do, which, like, if anybody's visited St. Pete, there's plenty to do. But, any place you grow up in feels like a fishbowl. And I left Florida for a couple of years. I lived in Mississippi for grad school. And that really changed for me. I think, being outside of Florida and thinking about all of the things that I missed, all of the people that I missed, the connection, the community, the fact that, I could drive past my high school and say, there are pictures of my grandmother in there. That's something that I don't think a lot of people in this day and age really have anymore. And so I felt really grateful for that. And I really, when I came back to Florida, I started thinking really hard about the reasons that I left, the reasons why I didn't want to be here, and I started kind of wondering, like, how much of this is like an internalized, like, anti-Florida bias that I'm picking up from, national headlines and social media and the way that Florida is talked about, in the kind of broader media landscape, and how much of this is like actually reflective of like what I experienced here and what I liked and disliked about growing up here. And so when I came back, I was really sorting through, what do I actually like and appreciate about this place? What do I not like and not appreciate about this place? And the way that has kind of transformed into the things that I write about and the things that I enjoy writing about is, I am so driven right now, particularly given, I think, the things that are going on in Florida, the way that Florida is being talked about, decisions that are being made. I feel so driven to talk about the things that make this place great. Not that I am trying to encourage people to move here. Stop moving here, please. Stop coming here. You're pricing us out. But, there's so much bad stuff swirling around about Florida that, I think a lot of people are kind of missing the counter narratives about grassroots resistance movements or, community building initiatives, or even things that like actually do pose a threat to this state that are important and worth paying attention to, get subsumed, by splashier news stories, I think. So I try to focus in my writing on little bits of historical information that I think are interesting and, people might not know. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald used to vacation in St. Pete and down in South Florida, and like to talk about writers, obviously, just because I like literature, but the Florida cranberry, and how it's really sorrel, Jamaican sorrel, but it's really not clear how it got here, and it probably came to Florida through the Trans-Caribbean slave trade. And, there's so many really interesting, fascinating things about Florida that I think just get overlooked because that doesn't fit the narrative of Florida that's already out there.
Right. So, like, in terms of my own journey with Florida, I moved to Florida for grad school when I was 21 or whenever that is, like right out of undergrad, right? And so, like, Florida was never a place I imagined living. I mean, I'm very much like, first of all, I'm a very sweaty person and I don't do well in heat. So that was like the biggest thing. I'm not like one of those beach people. I really prefer like the hills and the mountains, which is kind of where I grew up. But it was recommended that I apply to grad school at USF, and I ended up there, and it, that like certifiably changed my life. But, when I talk to my family about Florida, that's all they see, like the beach and like, the kind of trendy stuff. And like, they're like, why would you ever move away from there? You had the beach right there. And it's like, yeah, but like, it's so terrible in the summer and it rains like clockwork. Like you really don't get to enjoy it. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I do think that like the kind of grittier underbelly, so to speak, of Tampa, like dive bars and kind of rubbing elbows with the hospitality industry there. I mean, that really kind of shaped who I became like through my 20s. And I think, I mean, not to like draw like a false parallel to the things you're talking about, but I think like that real Florida is like often just overlooked by the media, to your point. And
Yeah.
that's like the Florida I love and the Florida that I see disappearing when I visit,
Yeah, and it's a Florida that's been disappearing for a very long time. I mean, Florida, was advertised as the last frontier, for a long time, and it was really appealing for a lot of people, particularly in the post-war era, who were finding, the industrialization and the urbanization of, places like New York and, other parts of the Northeast. They were finding that increasingly unattractive. And so they were like, oh, like we can go to this last frontier. Americans have always loved expansion.
Right.
We can go to this place and we can experience nature, and it's got the beach, and conveniently forgetting about the fact that it also had like it was swampy, and I think there was a lot of yellow fever and mosquitoes, and forgetting about all of that stuff. But it's just back to your point. I mean, it's been disappearing for at least over 100 years, if not more than that. It's been disappearing since European contact in reality. So I don't know. I mean, I get caught sometimes between this urge to preserve the Florida that I know and tell stories about it. And then I also get stuck sometimes between like, I don't want to tell stories about it because I don't want people to find this place interesting, because I don't want people to come here.
Yeah.
They call, well, I don't know who they is, but I heard someone say that Disney World is like the Vatican with Mickey Mouse ears. Right. And like you think about the Vatican as like this like largely representative figurehead,
Right.
and Disney is very much that for Florida, but it's not all that Florida is, and anybody who lives here will tell you that. But again, there are these narratives out there about what Florida is and who it contains and what the people are like, that I don't think are actually created by the people who live here.
Yeah.
And I find that problematic.
So that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, what do you feel as a native Floridian, as someone who writes about Florida and with all these things in mind, what do you think folks get right and get wrong about Florida? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure this could be like a whole 2-hour conversation, but
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Well, let me start with what people get right about Florida. That'll be easy. It's overdeveloped. It's expensive. It's hot. It's crowded. And it's a very complicated place to live right now. As far as what people get wrong about Florida, I heard this novelist, his name's Kent Wascom. He described Florida as a large mirror for the rest of the nation, which I found was really compelling and interesting. And I've been thinking about it actually for a couple of months, trying to figure out like what exactly he meant by that. And the way I interpret it is, when you look in a mirror, it's very easy to point out everything that you see wrong. It's very easy to point out all of the flaws. Yeah. And it's also very easy to forget the person in the mirror, which is usually often yourself. And so I think, if anybody is going to be really quick to point out what's wrong with Florida, or if they're going to be really quick to disparage Florida or denigrate people in Florida, they should pause and maybe take a second to self-reflect and think, what is it really that I'm making fun of here? And I want to be clear that I'm talking about a prejudice or an anti-Florida bias. I kind of brought that up earlier. I'm not talking about criticism. I think there are a lot of critiques of the way that Florida is being handled and managed and legislated that are absolutely fair.
So is it kind of like this idea of like an omnipresent Florida man? Is that kind of Like the kinds of
Yeah.
criticism you're talking about?
Yeah, I really didn't want to get into Florida Man just because I dislike that trope so much. But I mean, yes, I think, Florida Man is definitely something that I think we all need to move beyond and get past. And
Right.
you're from Kentucky. You and I have kind of talked about Appalachia, and I'm sure that you're familiar with the stereotypes,
Exactly.
about Appalachians. And we're kind of getting to a point, I think, where our national culture is kind of recognizing that that's not okay. You know what I mean? That like calling somebody a hillbilly is not okay. Calling somebody a redneck is really not okay. And this is just me kind of, I think, wildly hypothesizing here, but I think Florida Man has become like the latest stand-in for that term, and there's so many things wrong with it. Like, it's gendered, you know what I mean? It's classist. It's, so this is kind of what I'm talking about when it's like, if you think about Florida as a mirror that, you're holding up to the rest of the nation. It's like, well, if you're going to be really quick to, make these jokes or say these things, it might be worth kind of interrogating why you think it's appropriate to think those things and say those things. And I'm thinking of an example. I mean, this has happened to me. Like I went to Washington, D.C. with a group of my friends at this event at the Smithsonian. And, I was being introduced to some colleagues of theirs and, shaking hands. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm from Florida. And immediately she like put her hands up and was like, oh, I can't talk about that place. I just can't. And I was like, so you don't want to get to know me at all just because I'm from Florida, and that can be really tough. So, just kind of bring this back to, my goal with my writing and my creative practice and the stories that I'm drawn to and the stories that I want to tell. It's very much combating that idea that like, oh, this is a place that we don't want to talk about. This is a place that we don't want to hear about. I don't know if you've ever seen the meme that kind of circulates every hurricane season where Bugs Bunny is sawing the state of Florida off of the rest of the continental United States.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of like, let's not do that. Like, let's not just, kind of cut it off and let it float away. Like, let's talk about it and let's learn to appreciate it for a lot of the contributions that it does make.
And just to point out that like this attitude of like, oh, I don't want to talk about that place. Like, I don't want to get into it. I mean, that's kind of like a privileged point of view as well. I mean, like, and you're right. Like I can look around in where I live in Ohio and certainly see the same types of people that people don't want to hear about living in Florida. Right. Like if we're talking about like on the political spectrum, I think is kind of what we're kind of dancing around, which is fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally feel you.
Yeah, it's a complicated place to live. It's a beautiful place to live. It really is. I mean, there's a reason why so many writers came down to South Florida, in the early 1900s. And, people are usually surprised when I talk about this, but if you think about Florida writers traditionally, you think of Ernest Hemingway, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Zora Neale Hurston. But what a lot of people don't realize is that F. Scott Fitzgerald vacationed here. Judy Blume lives in Miami. Not Miami. I think she lives in Key West, but she lives in South Florida. Elizabeth Bishop lived in Key West. Robert Frost lived in Miami for a little while. Wallace Stevens came to South Florida for a little bit. Tennessee Williams lived in Key West. There's so many writers that spent time here in Florida, and Tom McGuane and Jimmy Buffett. And, there's this great short documentary on YouTube. I think it's called All That Is Sacred, about, the writing community in Key West. So, I mean, it's just Florida has always been a draw for artists and creatives for such a long time. And there's a reason for that I think people just aren't interested in. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah. Putting you on the spot a little bit, where is your favorite place in Florida to visit, to hang out, or to go?
Ooh, yeah, that's hard.
It's like, who's your favorite kid, right?
Yeah, that's hard. I do love Key West. I don't get down there very often because I think, you look at Florida on a map and you can see how long it is, but until you're actually driving from the top to the bottom, it's a long, 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 long haul. So definitely like Key West. I like hanging out in Ybor City, which I'm sure you're familiar with, living in Tampa. So I would say those two are my favorite. But I mean, I've been to a lot of places in Florida that I really enjoy. I love Pensacola. Jacksonville's great. St. Augustine is cool. Ormond Beach, Mount Dora. There's a lot of places in Florida that are really awesome, and they're all very different. I mean,
Yeah.
Florida. I'm talking about Florida as if it's a monolith, and it's not. I mean, it's very different whether you're in South Florida or North Florida, West Florida. I mean, I think it's got like something like 5 regions and 2 time zones, and I'm never going to stop talking about it. I think it's a great place. So,
Well, I will add to the chorus of St. Augustine. That was always my favorite place to visit. That wasn't like where I lived, right? So,
yeah, right.
well, so this kind of gets to my next question, which is, on your website you talk about your approach to storytelling, and I mean you've touched on all of this already, but so I'll just kind of ask you more directly. But you say that historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor are imperative when telling impactful stories about Florida. But I would go as far to say that these are qualities that are crucial, I guess, in any type of storytelling, and even like if you're just thinking about it as a consumer of a story or so like a writing, like if you're just a
Hmm.
reader, I think it's important to, I don't know, I think it's a good way to interpret the world, I guess.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
can you kind of break down these qualities as they pertain to your creative process, maybe specifically to Florida as you've pointed out, but also maybe more broadly?
Yeah, I think historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor are important for storytelling. I think it's important, like you're saying, just, as being a citizen of the world. I kind of I think about it in terms of being stewards of the future. We inherited decisions and consequences of decisions that people made before us. And people after us, are going to inherit our decisions and the consequences of our decisions. And so I think, whether you're telling stories, whether you're writing about something, whether you're consuming media, it is important to be aware that we don't exist in a vacuum, that, we didn't just spring out of some primordial goo. Like, historical context, I think, is something that we are losing sight of rapidly. And this isn't something that I would necessarily like lay blame on any one particular person's feet. I think, given the media landscape today and the fact that we are being bombarded by so much information constantly, it's hard to remember something from 2 weeks ago, let
Right.
alone historical information from decades ago or even centuries ago. But I think if you're going to tell a story, whether it's fiction, whether it's creative nonfiction, whether it's reporting, whether it's, you know, doing the historical research, going into the archives, looking at stuff, listening to oral histories, getting an understanding of the history of whatever it is that you're talking about is really important so that you can talk about it in a way that future people are going to be able to read it. And like you're saying about, being kind of like an ethical reader in a way, you know what I mean? You want to be able to convey the right information. um, Cultural awareness, I think it's kind of the same thing, but different in, again, we don't exist in a vacuum. And our perspectives are not the only perspectives. Everybody has a different lens, everybody has a different background from which they're approaching, a particular thing, whether it's somebody that you're interviewing for a story or whether it's somebody that you're writing about for a creative nonfiction project, or, I mean, so just being aware that not everybody is like you. Not
Right.
everybody is going
Yeah.
to think the way
Yeah.
you do. Not everybody's going to react the way you do. Not everybody's going to have the same background, I guess, that you do, for lack of a better word, is really important. And then empathy for me in my own creative practice, and I guess in other work that I'm really drawn to, I think empathy is something that we're losing sight of also. I mean, I have been kind of dancing around politics, but, we've become so polarized that, it's becoming increasingly impossible, I think, for people to dredge up, a kind of sense of empathy and compassion. And that is something that separates us. That is something that, makes us human, I think, is this ability to be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, or respect somebody else's feelings. And so I think it's a radical act to be able to find empathy for people, and for yourself, and for whatever it is that you're encountering to write about, or you know paint, or cook, or I mean whatever. I think just being able to like find empathy is a good skill to have, and I think is a worthwhile practice. And it is something that takes practice. It's not
For
easy.
sure. For
We just
sure.
watched the presidential debate. Like, finding empathy is not easy. But that's what makes it radical, I think. And I really firmly believe in the power of that.
Well, I mean, and to just add on to that, I mean, you talked about this conversation wading into politics a little bit, which is fine. We can do that. There's no rule, I guess. I make the rules, so whatever. Um, um, but what you're talking about, like a lack of empathy, or a lack of being willing to compromise, or if you take away that manifesting in our national politics, I see that kind of stuff just in everyday interactions with people that have nothing to do with politics.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
with people who, like, maybe, and I hate to even say like sides, but even with people who might be on the same side as me politically, right? Like,
Right.
that's that. So I don't know if, like, that's an issue of, like, the internet age maybe, or
Yeah.
uh you know
We've
yeah.
we've become increasingly disconnected from each other. Like, I mean, you and I are doing this having this chat right now, and it seems like we're in the same room, but we're not. Like, we're separated by a screen, and I read somewhere that screens trick you into thinking that you are having communion with another person, and so we think that we're well connected with each other, and we think that we, have community and all of these things because we can check in with our friends by text, or we can FaceTime our parents, or we can, Slack and Zoom and Skype and all of these things. But like in reality, we spend more time in front of our screens than I think we do. Well, I'm not going to say we, I'm going to say me. I spend more time in front of my screen than I do with other human beings, and I think that's when you do start to see like that empathy being eroded. And, like you're saying, like it has nothing to do with politics, it one of the things that always shocks people coming down anywhere to the South is that we don't honk our horns very often.
Mm,
That was something that I really appreciated living in Mississippi. People honk their horns a little bit in Tampa. I remember the first time I went to Washington, D.C., that was like the first air quotes big city that I ever went to. And I was shocked by the amount of times people were honking their horns at each other, like for no reason. Like I was always like, oh, like you honk your horn, like if somebody's about to hit you and you want to let them know that you're there. But like, you don't need to honk your horn because the light turned green and someone hasn't started driving in 4 seconds. Or, I think it's that kind of thing that I'm starting to see. People are rude to each other at the grocery store, or, you know, rude to people that don't have the same privilege that they do, and not being able to look beyond that. I realize I'm waxing philosophic, and you had me here to talk about writing, and instead I'm giving you my whole worldview. But yeah, I mean, I just think we've got to find a way. to reconnect with one another. And I guess this is kind of related to, our discussions about Florida and my goal with my writing. I'm trying to find a way to get people to reconnect with Florida in a way that understands that there are people here,
Mm,
that
yeah.
there are people here who think and who feel and who experience the world too. We don't just need to be sawed off from the continental United States and shipped out to sea. So I guess they kind of relate to each other in that way. I think if very broad scale, I want people to find empathy for this place that I live in. But, on a smaller scale, I think finding empathy for each other, on a daily basis is also really important.
I think you bring up an interesting point with like the screen stuff, or like even just texting, making that kind of like, oh, that's enough. Like that's my social, like connecting with people kind of a thing. I totally agree with that. But also you and I are in interesting positions that, you as a writer and me, I'll put my like broadcaster hat on, like as someone who shares myself in a very public way, and as a writer, you do the same and you have an audience. And it's like you said, like cultivating empathy as something you have to practice. I mean, that's something I feel like I have to practice constantly, because otherwise it's like I'm just in a room by myself, but I'm talking to a lot of people from this room by myself. And that's always been the case in radio, for as long as radio's been a thing, for what, 100 plus years. But it's an interesting kind of dichotomy, I think. At least I find myself in relation to what we're talking about. Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. It's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. I really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. Maybe I just answered my next question for you in talking about historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor, but I'm hoping you might have more to say. One of the questions I ask everybody is, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? Would it be those three things, or do you see it being a little bit different from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely a you could probably group them together as one pillar, maybe, as my approach. But there are a couple of other things too that are really important to me. And, I'll preface this by saying I am certainly not the most regimented writer that you will ever talk to. So, I know some people like the methodology is really important to them. So, I know somebody who writes everything by hand, first. I know some people who are adamant about reading out loud and some people who refuse to read out loud. Some people will write for, a certain number of words every day or write between a certain number of hours. And I've never been that regimented. But, one of the things that I think is is really important to me is self-talk. And one of the big things that I always try to remind myself when writing is that nothing is ever going to be good enough. And that sounds harsh and that sounds really self-deprecating. And I don't mean it in that way at all. I think I'm a big perfectionist and I'm somebody who can tinker with a paragraph for an hour, stare at the same sentence for 15 minutes, trying to figure out, do I want all of these commas in there? Do I want to take the commas out and replace it with the word and? Is this the right word that I want to use? Do I want to use something else? And a lot of the time, that's my future self talking to my present self, because my future self is thinking about what this thing is going to look like when it's published. And am I going to be okay with it when it's published? My present self has no way of knowing that.
Yeah.
And, in a lot of ways, that is me kind of getting in my own way. And, so telling myself, nothing is ever good enough is really just me trying to encourage my future self to be gentle with my present self by saying, of course, you're going to look at this thing later and say that you wish you had phrased something differently. Of course, you're going to say, well, I would write this totally differently if I could start all over. And that's just the nature of it. And I imagine that this is probably the same for writing and composing. There's a quality of finality to like publishing something or printing something or finishing something, like this is it. This is the thing. It's immortalized on this sheet of paper or PDF or what have you. And that's it. And I tend to think of it as a little bit more living than that, because you're going to return to this thing that you wrote and you're going to interact with it and you're going to engage with it in a different way. And I've done that before, where I've gone back to things that I've written in the past. There are some things that I absolutely won't look at all, because I'm just like, I can't handle it, and then there are some things that I go back and I look at and I'm like, I probably could have used a different word, or, some of my stories from the Tampa Bay Times, I'm like, oh, that was a fact error. How did I not catch that? Or I probably could have started this piece a little differently. I think just accepting that as a reality is really important for removing that roadblock and to keep myself working, to keep myself kind of pushing through. So nothing is ever good enough. It's never going to be perfect. There's no such thing as perfection. Of course, I'm going to want to do this differently 10 years from now. But if I am constantly thinking about that, then I'm never going to get anything done. I'm never going to do anything. So that's probably the biggest one for me, is that kind of self-talk and future self, present self kind of vacillation, I think is a big one for me.
As soon as you said that, nothing will ever be good enough, I knew exactly what you were talking about, because you're right. There's such a correlation. And I talk about this and think about this a lot on and off this podcast. And I've had guests come on and talk about this idea of like the permanence of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think my mind has shifted. I started talking to people for this podcast in March. I think if you listen to every episode, you might hear like my mind change in real time about this, because I always used to be, well, I'm also a bit of a perfectionist, but I've tried to like grapple with that in different ways. But I could never grapple with the fact that, like, especially once a piece of music is recorded and put on a CD, perhaps, I mean, that's like, you can't change it anymore. And I'll listen and I'll be like, oh, there's a different level of sensitivity, I think, about things now, that it's like, oh, I would definitely go in and change that. I was talking to a guest on the show. I think I've talked with multiple people about it, so I can't remember who exactly, but it was like, well, why does it have to be that way? Just because it's recorded, like, why not go back and change it? Why not? And it's like, yeah, that's right. So now I'm
Yeah.
starting to think about it a little bit differently, and I'm looking at like music I wrote 10 years ago, and I'm like sending it along to people to check out and maybe do something with in the future. And I'm like, actually, I would really want to change like just little things about it, like pacing, or,
Mm-hmm.
even like this note, or like the comma, or the and thing. It's like stuff like that. Right.
Yeah.
But musically. So I totally get where you're coming from. And I think that's so important.
Yeah. Yeah. We can get in our own way, I think. And, this is kind of going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, of our conversation, that one of the beautiful things about, freelance writing and creative writing is that, it's organic and you can pick and choose, what pitches you might want to answer, or, where you want to submit and how long it takes you to work on a certain thing. But when you don't have a deadline that's encouraging you to just get the thing off your desk, I mean, you can sit there and tweak with it endlessly. And I beat myself up the most, I think, when I'm writing. I'm sitting there and I get, writer's block, and I'm just, oh my God, like, why can I not figure out what that word is? Or why can I not get this sentence to work? Or, and I'm sure that lots of writers go through this, because writing is so much more revising than
Yeah.
actual writing. Like, you are spending so much more time going through and changing everything that you just wrote than actually producing new material. That's been my experience always. Anyway, I if somebody can just sit down, and I think Jack Kerouac wrote, maybe it was the Dharma Bums, but I think he sat down and just like he either hand wrote it or typed it on like a scroll, and it just barely revised it, and it was just, so I mean, there are a handful of people who can do that, and if you can do
Yeah.
that, please get in touch with me and let me know your strategy. I am not one of those people, but anyway, yeah, I think we have a tendency to get in our own way, and in any way that we can be gentle with ourselves about that and get ourselves out of our own way is really crucial.
Totally. So we've touched on this just a little bit, but it's another part of your work that I really want to talk about because it's a passion of mine, and that's the writing that you do related to food. So you
Yeah.
were talking about your Ina Garten story earlier, like your experiment with her cookbook, and kind of how that maybe changed the way you thought about things. And so nowadays, a lot of your writing is about Florida or Florida adjacent. It's also usually food or food adjacent. So like you've contributed to national publications like Eaton Magazine and Gastronomica. So was the Ina Garten event when you started thinking about food as something worth writing about, or did that happen at a later date? And how's your writing about food changed over
Mm,
time?
yeah, I definitely think the Ina Garten piece had something to do with it. I touched on this a little bit before, but talking about like what is good olive oil, what is good vanilla, and this isn't groundbreaking. I mean, a lot of people have been asking this question, like, what do you mean, Ina? But there are so many ways that you can answer that question, and I think one of the things that I really love about food as kind of a vessel for communication or for meaning is, I mean, there are so many different things you can talk about. First of all, with food, it hits all of the senses. You can see it, hear it, touch it, taste it, smell it. And we'll just do a little thought experiment really quickly. Like, if you take a tomato, right? I mean, there are so many different things that you can talk about with a tomato. You can talk about industrial agriculture and the way that tomatoes have slowly lost their flavor over time. You can talk about labor exploitation with tomatoes. Bringing this back to Florida, if anybody has not read Tomatoland by Barry Estabrook, I really recommend it. You can talk about imperialism and colonialism. Like, if we take, for example, Italy and India, two cuisines where tomato has become, I would say, integral and in some ways representative of cuisine, where tomatoes are not native to either of those places. Tomatoes have not always been a part of that cuisine. And a lot of the time they still aren't a part of that cuisine, but in a lot of ways
Yeah.
tomatoes have become very representative of Italian and some Indian dishes. So, there you can talk about things like, the spice trade, you can talk about globalization, you can talk about intercultural exchange. They're just, I could go on and on and on about this forever, but you can talk about class, you can talk about gender, you can talk about race, you can talk about globalization. I kind of already mentioned that. You can talk about art, literature, music. I mean, you've composed music about food, so
Right. Yeah.
I know you kind of pick up what I'm putting down.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that you can interpret it, and there are so many ways that you can make meaning out of food. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying about cultural awareness. Like, everybody is going to encounter a food object or a food item in a different way. It might trigger a memory for them. It might remind them of a particular place. It might transport them back in time. It's such a fruitful, pun intended, conversation starter and vehicle for storytelling that I'm obsessed with it. I love food writing. I will always, in some form or fashion, I think, try to find a food angle in most, if not everything, that I write.
So my food journey, shockingly maybe, started when I moved to Florida, actually.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I was I've talked about this just a little bit on the podcast, but I'll talk about it a lot bit now with you because I was the absolute pickiest eater for, I mean, I'm 33, so like most of my life still,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Like it wasn't until I moved to Florida and Susanna, my wife, my now wife, who was my girlfriend then, had a lot to do with it because like I remember she made me like green beans one night. She was like,
Hmm.
I'm gonna make like chicken and green beans or something. And I was like, "Ugh, I don't like green beans. Like I can't eat green beans. And she's like, you're gonna eat them. I'm making them. You're gonna eat them, right? And this gets into like something like her mom. Susanna has been steeped in like food culture a lot of her life. Her mom owned Chinese restaurants, and a lot of like the love language from her mom, for example, is like food, right? Like, and so at any rate, Susanna was like, "You're gonna show that you love me by eating what I make you, right?" And so, so she made
Go
these green.
Susanna.
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that.
it changed my life. She made like these green beans, and it was like fresh green beans, like from the produce section, and like I'd never actually seen that before. I like my family always had canned green beans. She like had like garlic and red onion sort of thing going on, and like a vinaigrette. And I took a bite reluctantly, and then I was like, "What do you mean green beans can taste like this?" Right? So
Yeah.
I think like that kind of like opened the door for me, and then I think what kicked it down, and this is something I wanted to talk with you about, was Anthony Bourdain's work. Like kicked down the door for me, and like being able to see him go on TV, like go to all these different places, and Tampa still, but I think especially 10 years ago or even 8 years ago, like had such an amazing food scene that it's just like the stars aligned for me. And like I watched all of Anthony Bourdain's stuff like one summer, and Susanna was force feeding me stuff that I began to love, and then like I'd go to all these different restaurants. So I say all that. It sounds like I'm randomly rambling, but I say all that because I used to be someone who did not think about food at all. Like it was,
Hmm.
and I think a lot of people in our society, in our culture, don't think about food. It's just like they either totally forget to eat or they only eat because they have to live. Do you ever think about like how you can change the way people perceive food in your writing, or is that maybe like too big of a an issue?
No, I don't think so. I think, Anthony Bourdain, certainly somebody that I read and read and read and watched and read. Um, Miss him so
Oh
much.
yeah,
He kind of had this like uncanny ability to like be the voice of reason, but like be cool as shit about it. Like, sorry to cuss, but I mean, he, I don't know. I mean, but for me, Anthony Bourdain was kind of the first person that I saw model this idea of, historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor. I mean, in his show and in his writing, and, he's taking you to these other places, and he's just, I mean, there's no judgment. There's no turning his nose up at something. There's no disrespect. I mean, he's just treating everybody that he encounters as a fellow human being on the planet that we all
right.
inhabit and are all partially responsible for. And so he was definitely a role model to me, I think, for that approach, and was really important for me in getting me to think about food in different ways, because I think I really first started really reading him and paying. I mean, he's been around for a long time, but he'd Oh God, I hate even having to do that. He'd been around for a really long time, and I started interacting with his work when I was getting serious about food writing. And at the time, I was doing it because I was like, well, going to restaurant openings is really fun, and doing the kind of prefix menus is really cool, and getting to go to these fancy parties and write about them and try food and get exposed to all of these cool things. This is so amazing. While all these people that I know from college are chained to their desks, putting in 50, 60 hours a week. And I'm out here having fun and getting
Right.
paid for it. Eventually, that started changing. Eventually, I kind of wanted to write more serious things. There is a huge food insecurity problem in the Tampa Bay area. When I reported on it, I think 1 in 4 school children were considered food insecure, didn't know where their food was coming from. But back to my point, I was interested in things like urban farming and food insecurity, and I was really thinking about, this idea of, back then we called it food deserts. Now I think the more appropriate term is food apartheid. But why were parts of St. Pete loaded with grocery stores? Like, you could walk out of one grocery store, trip, fall, and when you stood back up, you were in another grocery store. And then you go to some parts of it and there are no grocery stores. And I remember that was kind of the thing that really started getting me thinking about food in a different way, because now you're starting to think about race. St. Pete is still pretty racially segregated in terms of geography and where people live, and school zones and all kinds of things. You can talk about class, you can talk about socioeconomic status. There are all kinds of things that you can talk about, and I didn't feel like I really had the vocabulary to do that. I didn't feel like I had the appropriate background to do that empathetically and ethically and properly. So I wanted to report on those more serious food issues. And so I went to grad school in Mississippi and did my master's in Southern Studies there. But yeah, kind of bobbing and weaving and coming back to your original question about, Anthony Bourdain and this kind of, changing the way that people think about food. There's this idea that food is something that we can all universally relate to on some level. Not everybody has access to the same foods. So I want to be clear about that. But, as human beings, food is something that we have to eat to survive. And so at a basic level, we all understand that. And we can all relate to food in that way. And so I think that it's really important that if there is this one universal thing that we can all relate to, then there is this one universal thing that we can use to talk about the human experience and to talk about living, and
Right.
coexisting and all of those things. And I am of the personal opinion that one can't exist freely until everyone exists freely. And I think food is a really good way of getting people to think about that, because it is something that's like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way before, and it's generally, I mean, food is generally like a low stakes entry point, you know what I mean? Like a tomato or a slice of key lime pie, you know what I mean? Like, you can start with something like that to get somebody's attention, and then you can really kind of push people to think about things in a different way. And I think that's really appealing. And I don't want to say that I am always effective at it. There's some people who are really good at it, Anthony Bourdain. And then, it's something, to constantly work at and practice. And there's also this part of it that I haven't really talked about, but also being able to find, the publications that are willing to put out, those kinds of narratives, or
Right.
to talk about food in that way. Like, you have to be really conscientious, isn't the word that I'm looking for, but you do have to be intentional about, where you're publishing certain things. And yeah.
Well, I guess as with anything that one might choose to write about or talk about or anything in the world, I mean, there's like a spectrum of things like you're talking about. And I mean, I don't know anything about publications, but I know like when I open up Instagram, for example, and I'm scrolling and I'm fed all this content that I didn't even sign up for, and a lot of it's food because that's an interest of mine, and it's all like
Mhm.
feel good recipe, like sharp looking, like, influencer fun stuff, right? Because
Right.
that's what sells. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing that the majority of publications, that's the kind of flavor they're looking for. No pun intended there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are a handful of magazines out there and a handful of publications, I should say, out there that do want to tell impactful stories through food. I can think of a handful of digital born publications. I can think of a few print. Oxford American does a lot of
Mm,
really cool food culture stuff.
I love that one.
Um, Sever is also really good about, cultural awareness and empathy and not being Americentric, which I think is also really important. So, I mean, there are publications out there that do it. You just, you have to tailor your pitch to who you're sending it out to and make sure that, I don't know, I guess for me it was just I just had to be clear with myself that I'm not interested in writing about recipes. I mean, there's nothing wrong with somebody who does want to write about recipes. I love cookbooks. I love food blogs. I love people who share recipes and who share methods for cooking. But that's just not what I want to write about. I want to write about serious issues, not always serious. I mean, sometimes it can be fun. Like I think, one essay that I wrote this was on my Substack. I wrote an essay about going to the Versace mansion for lunch in Miami. And, the headline was I took my Spanx off in Gianni Versace's bathroom. And so, it was kind of this like fun little entry into what does it mean that there's a restaurant at a place where a man was murdered?
Mm, yeah.
A queer man was murdered and you walk over those steps to talk to the hostess. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so, it was starting with something fun. And I mean, the food there was really good. I will say that. But, there's always something else to think about. There's always something else to consider, and in that piece, if you want to talk about historical context, I know that the house is very important to queer historians of Miami. And, if you want to talk about cultural awareness, it's a sign of gentrification, where it's located, how expensive it is. You can talk about labor and the people who work there. You can talk about the food that they serve there. You can talk about sky's the limit. I mean, you could really talk about all kinds of things, just about that one place and about that one experience that I had, going to get lunch there during a bachelorette party. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, I think, is kind of taking this experience that I've had or, that somebody else has had and really kind of digging into what does this mean? What are some other ways that we can think about this? What are some other questions that we can ask as a way to kind of develop empathy, right? I
Right.
mean, it's so easy to go to the Versace mansion. You were just talking about Instagram. It's so Instagrammable and it's so, bucket list and it's so all of these things, but if you really sit there and you think about somebody was shot right here on these steps and died, and I'm going to get a bougie lunch here because it's something I can take a picture of and put on Instagram. So I don't know. I hope I answered your question.
I think so because again, not to keep like bringing it back to Bourdain, but like what you're describing that you're doing in your work, that's what he did. Like he balanced like it's kind of like level of entertainment, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
with like some really serious stuff, and he made it accessible. And I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of that's what's important, is making it accessible for like the regular person without dumbing it down, making it like viral Instagram, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really tough to do too. I think this isn't something that we've really touched on at all, but my background is in food writing, of course, but I'm also a scholar. I'm in a PhD program right now, and I did some research and some scholarly work in my master's program too. And being able to write about something serious or something that might have scholarly value, but write about it in an accessible way for a public audience takes practice and is
Yeah.
really hard. Which is why, again, I love Anthony Bourdain. I mean, he was able to talk about some really smart stuff in a really accessible way that made everybody feel included. You know what I mean? That didn't make anybody feel like, oh, I don't know what this is. I'm not smart enough to engage with this, or I'm not cultured enough to interact, with this. He drew you in because he was so welcoming, and he was so engaging, and he could talk about food in a way that really made you feel good about having spent an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours of your time, watching his show or
Right.
reading something that he wrote. And I would love to be able to replicate that one day. I'm not Anthony Bourdain by any stretch of the imagination, nor will I ever will be, but I definitely think he's a role model for a lot of food writers, and definitely someone whose work is worthy of the recognition that it's gotten.
For sure. And I mean, not just food writers, because he's a role model of mine when it comes to presenting
That's correct.
information
Yeah,
to an audience,
that's
and
right.
I'm with you. I'm like, I don't think I could ever be him for a variety of reasons, but damn, I'm gonna try.
Yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure.
Because that level of connection changed my life, and maybe I can pass that along in some weird way with the weird music that I like. So this is another thing that I always ask everybody, and it's always exciting to hear what people have to say. But what is an artistic artifact? So, something like a piece of art or a book, a piece of writing, music, even an experience that you've had, anything like that that changed the way that you thought about your work, changed your approach, maybe changed your life, even.
um this is a good question. I would say Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. It's a story about a single day. It's about stream of consciousness. And, I was actually recently introduced to a writing exercise where you kind of looked around the room that you were in, you picked an object, you wrote a sentence or two about it, and then you thought some more about it, and then you kept writing. And, for the longest time, I mean, I've always loved Virginia Woolf. I've always loved Mrs. Dalloway. But for the longest time, I really kind of struggled. I was like, how in the world can she write about a single day? How can she write this much about a single day and stream of consciousness? I mean, I don't have that running through my brain all the time. But, in this exercise, I wrote about carpet squares. And, I was writing about how these carpet squares reminded me of a quilt. And somebody in the class had just been talking about quilts. And my mom likes to quilt. And then, I was like, my dad used to say that he would sew up his cuts with dental floss. And I mean, it just, the way that one observation about carpet squares kind of tripped me into, I ended up writing like I think two full paragraphs starting with the carpet squares, but then everything that I thought about the carpet squares. And I was trying really hard to embody this stream of consciousness idea. And so, I think at one point I was like, oh, I need to check my mail, and oh, I forgot to take out the trash. But I thought that was such an interesting exercise. And it's not like an artifact in the sense that like it's not something like super old. Like this is a recent experience that I had, but I think it's definitely going to shape my artistic practice moving forward because it was just such a fascinating approach to seeing something and then taking that thing kind of beyond itself and, you know, turning it into something else. And I thought that was really cool. And it's really fun. You can do it at any time. You can be on an
Right.
airplane and you can just
Right.
sit there and do it. Or, you can hopefully don't do it while you're driving or if you do use voice dictation. And this is kind of what I meant at the beginning of our conversation, that anybody can be a writer. Anybody can do that. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be Virginia Woolf. I'm not Virginia Woolf either. Like, it's something that anybody can do at any time. I mean, we all have, well, I don't want to say we all have phones, but I think most of us have smartphones by this point, or at least have access to pen and paper, and it's a lovely way, I think, to kind of flex that creative muscle and see what happens. And how much time do we really have to spend with ourselves like that
Yeah.
anymore? So I think that was definitely one piece of art that has really shaped me and is probably going to continue to shape me for a long time.
Yeah. I could see that. I mean, and the exercise you're talking about, I can imagine being very cathartic. Like I've kind of just like sat at my computer sometimes if I need to like work something out and just like type whatever I'm thinking, and then it's like, okay, it's down. I don't have to think about it anymore,
Yeah.
and then I can move on with my life and
Yeah.
revisit it if I feel like it.
Yeah, it can be cathartic in some ways. It can be disturbing in some ways to kind of see where your brain goes. If you kind of treat it like a diary exercise, and let's say you do it for a week, see how many times your thoughts keep coming back to the same thing over and over again.
Mm,
But I would highly encourage anybody to try it out and see what happens. I had a lot of fun. I thought it was really cool. And yeah, I mean, see where it takes you. Anybody can be a writer, anybody can do it.
yeah, I like it. So this is, I guess, technically a music podcast, though I'm trying to make it not so much one in
Yeah.
the future, which is why you're here. But I guess I have to ask you about music in your life. So,
Yeah.
what role has music played in your life, or currently plays in your life, and what role does it play in your creative process, if it does at all?
So I'll start actually with music. I was very fortunate as a child to be able to take music lessons. So I took piano for a couple of years. I played the flute at school. I sang, but I always struggled with music. I had a difficult time seeing a notation on a page and translating that to an appropriate finger position. And I had a difficult time seeing a note on a page and being able to hear what that note sounded like. It took a really long time for my brain to compute that. And so practicing music was always very frustrating for me. I was a horrible sight reader. I mean, I was a terrible sight reader. And, when I would come home and practice, I would always find myself, I would stop practicing based on like, whatever music book I had in front of me. And I would start trying to teach myself something that I had heard on the radio that morning because I knew what sounded good. I
Yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
read music to save my life. I found it very frustrating, but I knew what sounded good. And I would know that I had played a wrong note because I was like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Not because the page told me it wasn't right, but because I knew the sound wasn't what it should have been. And I think a lot of a lot of that carried over for me into writing. I am not good with grammar. I cannot tell you what a preposition is. I have no idea. But I know what sounds right. I'm one of those people who does like to read my writing out loud. And I mean, there's so many different ways that you can, kind of play with a sentence or a paragraph or even a word if you're James Joyce. You can fiddle around with things to get them to sound a certain way. We talked about commas and, the word and. Couldn't tell you what part of speech that is. Is it a conjunction? I don't know. You can add a bunch of commas if you want something to have kind of like a staccato sound, or you can add, the word and in place of all the commas if you want to make the sentence longer and kind of give it a different tempo. You can change up your sentence lengths. You can repeat, certain vowel sounds or certain consonant sounds, use alliteration. You can do all kinds of things to change the way something reads and the way that something sounds. And I fixate on that. I mean, I want it to sound right. I want it to convey a certain meaning, of course, but I also want a word to sound good next to the word that comes after it and before it. And I'm not the only writer who thinks this way and who feels this way. I was reading The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion a couple of weeks ago, and she talks about this too, where it's like, she wasn't very good with grammar. She wasn't very good with parts of speech, but she knew what sounded right, and she knew when she had written something that sounded the way that she wanted it to. So I guess I'm kind of answering your question more about the role that sound plays in my life as
Oh, I
opposed
love it.
to
Yeah.
music as like a structural thing. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, my experience with music was I like the way something sounds, but as far as like the technique and the rules and the can't do it. And it's very much the same with writing. I mean, I know when something sounds good. I know, like, when I read something, I'm like, ooh, that was good. I mean, I think a lot of people have that same experience when you're reading or writing or, listening to music or composing. Like, you hear a certain phrase and you're just like, ooh, like it kind of gives you chills. Like, you're like, that's good. You know what I mean? And you can accomplish that by abiding by certain rules. But I think sometimes too, there's something else there that you're capturing that and that you're conveying, I guess, and it has more to do, I think personally, with sound over rules. But we started this conversation too talking about how I don't like answering prompts, so you know i guess I guess I don't like rules very much. I don't know.
It sounds like you'd also be very good at writing for the radio. Because I mean, what you're talking, I mean, I do a lot of writing, but it's like it's a very certain kind of writing that's like meant to be read aloud. And I'm with
Mhm.
you. Like, I don't know anything about like I know what a subject is, but like predicate, like all that
Right.
kind of stuff,
Yeah.
like I never think about those when I write. I just know that like, if I write this down and I read it this way, it sounds like I'm having a conversation with you. And if I write it down this other way, it sounds like I'm reading off of a script.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that kind of gets back to what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a musical quality to words. That's why we call something lyrical. And this is why, someone might call a string of words that has a certain style to it, they might call it a voice. I mean, there's so much, I think, that connects music and writing in terms of sound and oral qualities. And this is why I think rap is so cool,
Yeah.
because it's as much about the words as it is about the music. And I think, I know you said that this is a music podcast and you're trying to expand it. I think, writing and music have a ton of things in common. I think it totally makes sense for you and I to be friends, not just because of Anthony Bourdain, but, I think there are a lot of commonalities between, the two things that we practice. And I think that's very cool.
Yeah, I agree. So, kind of getting into my final series of questions that I ask everybody, but of course for you, they'll be just slightly different. What do you think you would be doing if it wasn't writing? If you pursued like a totally different path, what would it be?
I think I kind of want to be a cheesemonger.
Oh,
Like, that's such a
yeah,
that's such a wild different. I don't know. I mean, I change my mind all the time. Last week I was getting really frustrated with work and I was like, I'm just going to go be a manager at PetSmart. So I think, part of me's kind of always wanted to open a wine and cheese shop. I think that could be a lot of fun. I don't know anything about owning my own business though. I think I would probably really struggle there. But yeah, I mean, I would probably work in food in some way, shape, or form, whether it's, being a cheesemonger or owning a wine shop, or it might be fun to work in a bookstore. I love books so much, clearly, and I don't think I'm ever going to get very far away from food or literature. I was about to say put my pen down, but I don't write with a pen. Like, I may close my laptop for a little while and not write, but I think in some way I will always stick with literature or food in some way.
Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? We've kind of talked
Um,
about that like really brilliant exercise you mentioned earlier. I love that. So I'm
yeah,
curious to
I
hear more.
like the Virginia Woolf exercise. I don't really have a tool. I think, one thing that was really helpful, so I guess I do have a tool. It's called Pomodoro tracking. I think it's a website. Like, what you do is you set up intervals for writing, and then you take intervals of breaks. So it's almost kind of like working out, you know what I mean, where you do reps, you do a certain number of reps and then you rest, and then you do a certain number of reps and then you rest. It's that. So you just set your little timer for 30 minutes and you write for 30 minutes, and then you give yourself a 15-minute break and you stretch, or you get coffee, or you watch 15 minutes of the Great British Bake Off or something like that. And when that 15 minutes is over, then you have to come back and sit down and write for another 30 minutes. Because I'm sure you can relate to this. It can feel very monotonous, and it can
Oh yeah.
feel, unless every so often, I like to call this, it's like that feeling when scissors catch on wrapping paper,
Oh
and they
yeah.
just glide. Sometimes you can get into that when you're writing, and you can just glide, and everything can go so well. And, you can have a really great night, and all of a sudden it's 2 o'clock in the morning. If you're a night writer like I am, some people like to write in the morning, but if it could be 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and you're like, oh my God, how is it this late? I've written so much. I've had such a great time. And then other times you can sit down and it can feel like pulling teeth, to write one sentence. It's like, how am I going to do this? And so Pomodoro tracking is really helpful for those moments, I think, when you have writer's block. And you can use it for academic writing too. If if we have any academics listening to this, which we might, it's really helpful for kind of breaking things into chunks, and I'm going to do this for 30 minutes. I'm going to just write what I can, get what I can on paper for 30 minutes. And I know that I have a 15-minute break coming up. So it kind of helps incentivize you, carrot before the horse. You've got this break, kind of looming out there in the distance, and you just got to do what you can and write what you can for 30 minutes. And then you can reward yourself however you want to in those 15 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I mean, you can set it up however you want. But
Sure.
that would be the thing that I would recommend, probably, because it works really well for me, but it might not work for everybody.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's variations to it. And two come to mind because I've been wrestling with this a lot lately. And I will say I feel very fortunate to the nature of my work. All of my work allows me to work within ebbs and flows of energy. And so obviously we're all human. Sometimes we have to do stuff and we don't feel like doing it. And so I'm trying to play around with like a structure to my day that allows me to wear the different hats that I wear and focus on things in a very intentional way without getting burnt out, especially. And so I think like kind of combining what you're saying with like blocks of time, like, okay, for 4 hours, I'm going to do this one task or these tasks that are related to this one thing. And then, later on in the afternoon, I'll kind of shift my focus to this different thing. But I had a teacher tell me once, and I know if this teacher is listening, he'll know who he is, and maybe other people will figure it
Hi.
out too. Yeah, thank you for listening. He said that another professor was telling him that he had this trick that he did, and my teacher was like, "Why don't you tell students this?" And the other professor's like, I don't know." And it's like this really great trick where it's like if you don't feel like doing something, just try to do it for 5 minutes and say, "Okay, I'm going to do it for 5 minutes, and if it's not working, then I'll step away." But chances are, 5 minutes is enough for you to get into a groove and kind of get after it. So
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. One thing I heard, I've never really tried it before. And I don't know if this would work for music at all. But one thing I've heard people try when writing is, write until you get into a groove. Once you get into a groove, stop, because then that gives you something to pick up with the next day, rather than, kind of sitting down and like staring at this blank piece of paper and being like, well, I don't know what to do. So rather than like, we'll talk about like an academic paper, for example, rather than like kind of writing to the end of your first section or whatever, maybe write half of your first section, get into a groove, know where you're going, stop, so that when you come back to write, you have something to pick up and you can kind of ease yourself back into that groove rather than feeling like you're starting from zero. I can never really remind myself to do that because I usually get so excited that I'm in a
Yeah.
groove that I just want to play it out. But, that might be something that's worth trying too. If anybody that's listening is experiencing some sort of writer's block. But
Yeah.
you'd have to tell me if that could work with music and composing. I don't know.
Funny enough, my guest last week, Roger Zaire, he's a composer.
Mm-hmm.
That was his answer to the question I just asked. So it's
interesting.
funny.
Okay.
It's funny you bring it up because yes,
All right.
I think it works beautifully. So
thanks, Roger.
Yeah. So my final question for you is your chance to say really whatever you want to say. I mean, we've talked a lot. So the question is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I mean, I think I kind of already said it, but I think anybody can be a writer. I hear so many times people say, I'm such a bad writer. I don't know how to write. I can't write. And like, you can speak. If you can speak, you can write. And there's so many tools now too that talk to text, and, AI is dabbling in it, and dictation, and, all of this stuff. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a reason why they call it voice, and you have a distinctive way of speaking. You have a distinctive way of writing. Some people, have to work really hard to develop a voice. And, I don't want to diminish people's talent by making it say like, oh, all you have to do is talk to text and that's writing. It is a craft, and it is something that you have to hone, and it's something that you have to constantly work at. But I don't know if I necessarily always buy this idea of, oh, I can't write, I'm a bad writer. Like, I don't think I just genuinely don't think that's true. Like, we spend so much time texting and so much time emailing and so much time. I mean, we don't talk on the phone anymore. It's so when someone's like, I'm a bad writer, and I'm like, I have an easier time believing that you're a bad speaker before
Yeah.
believing that you're a bad writer, because for the most part, people that I interact with at least spend a lot more time typing than probably talking. And that's, probably an exaggeration and maybe not entirely true. But my point, I think, is just that it's something that anybody can do. And if anybody out there wants to try it, go for it. I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority. I have a hard enough time calling myself a writer. Like, we already talked about this. But communicating is also, I think, one of the beautiful qualities that we have as human beings, and the fact that we can communicate through the written word in a way that is preserved, and can be passed along and passed down. And I just think that that's something that people should embrace and take a stab at and really try before they say they can't do it.
Yeah. Great way to cap off this conversation. Carlynn, this has been so good. It's been great catching up with you, and just it's really exciting to see all the work that you do, and it's been great learning about it. So thanks so much again for your time today. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tyler.
So that approach to storytelling, historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor. Carlynn, I gotta say, I'm gonna steal that. It's just too good. You can learn more about Carlynn and read some of her excellent writing on her website. That's carlyncrosby.com, and I do hope you'll take some time to do that. I think it's quite worthy of your time. And she also has a fantastic Substack newsletter, which I will put a link to in the show notes as well. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of this podcast, as well as ways to support the podcast and network. That's it. That'll do it for my time here today, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you here next time for the next edition of Music Maker.